Hi everybody, this is Luke again, and today I'm taking a short break from our regular AI scripting series for a bit of a special ThursDev requested by one of our watchers. Thank you very much, Can Turkleton, I hope I pronounced that correctly, for the topic. So this is actually a question that I, and likely most game designers, get asked fairly frequently by many people interested in breaking into the game development scene, which is, what should I do to become a game designer? And on a broader sense, what should I do to get into game development? Of course, these are intertwined questions, but have slightly different answers. Since my personal discipline in game development is design and production with a background in QA, I'd like to field both of these questions to the best of my ability, or at least start doing so, and we'll open up for questions in our comment section afterward, which I can continue to address in following videos. So, you want to design video games. That's great, a lot of people do, and for good reason. It's a cool, fun, and honestly fairly coveted job. The outward appearance of the game designer is that of the person who comes up with the ideas for a game, writes them down, then sort of sits in the director's chair to make it analogous to filmmaking, and makes sure that the game is being made right. In a manner of speaking, the film director analogy isn't strictly wrong, but it's definitely not exactly what a game designer does either. Of course, it's not uncommon to see a person who has designer somewhere on their business card sitting in a metaphorical director's chair, but that's usually the creative director or chief creative officer of a studio. The first misconception about game designers is that we're the idea guys. Sadly, though we'd love to be, that's far from the main scope of our jobs. A game typically starts as a pitch, or at least a rough idea, which can be anything from a few bullet points on the back of a napkin to a fully realized pitch document made in PowerPoint with custom concept art. This isn't always created, though, by the designer. More frequently, in my personal experience, this is done by a studio's creative director, by a committee, or sometimes by a production or even marketing team. There's really no one idea guy in games. The designers are the writing pool, the cameramen, the editors, the best boys, and the grips, and the location scouts, to bring it back to the filmmaking analogy. So the first thing that we should do before we even start to talk about what you need to do to become a game designer is to define what a game designer really is. Now, I think I should begin by saying that every development studio is different. Unlike a lot of industries, this is a business that's largely driven by creatives, and creative people are frequently less receptive to the idea of strictly defining roles. Indeed, in every game studio I've ever worked in or with, the definition changes a little bit in one direction or another of any real job. Maybe not as drastically as, say, producer, a role which even producers often struggle to define. Also, designers in varying studios will often have more or less responsibility than others. As a general rule of thumb, the bigger the studio you're working in, the more narrow your job becomes. But there are other things I should say before I get too far into that. In broad terms, there's at least one definition that's pretty much universally accepted when describing a game designer. They're the people who are responsible for translating a project's creative vision, in whole or in part, from concept into components that can then be created, if necessary, and implemented into the game. What that means is the game designer is the person who creates the things in the game before they're modeled or programmed, if that makes sense, on paper. And of course, by paper I mean any number of digital tools that are a lot more practical than actually using paper. What form this act of creation takes is often based on what kind of game designer the person is, as it's perhaps lesser known, but there are actually a few different kinds of game designers within the industry. In smaller studios, these different subdisciplines usually are less cut and dry because a single designer needs to be able to do all of the different areas of design, but in larger game companies they start to diverge a lot more. Throughout their career, most designers will dabble in all of the following, but most find fairly quickly that their own design strengths really fall into one of these categories. I'm going to name 3 broad types of designer here, and go into what each is as we go. Since it's where I fall most solidly on the spectrum, I'll begin with what's commonly referred to as the systems designer. This is the most technical of the designer archetypes, as they're designing what's under the hood of the game typically. The systems designer is responsible for defining all of the underlying mechanics of a game. Its many systems, from the way that each AI behaves, to their individual parameters and how they interact with the game world, what sort of mechanics are needed in the game, and how they should be created by the programming team, in theory. They're responsible for making sure that the game will work without becoming overcomplicated or messy, and that it'll be as tight an experience as possible through constant fine-tuning of stats, pacing, and game balancing. They'll also very closely work with the programming team typically, and are responsible frequently for a lot of the high-level scripting. The next designer archetype is the experienced designer. This, I think, is probably what a lot of people think of when they envision a game designer, really, though it's also more technical than many may think. The experienced designer is focused on ensuring that a game both looks and feels perfect for the project. They define visual style, user interface, narrative pacing, and in what manner the narrative should be presented to the player. They typically deal a lot with gameplay flow, generally speaking ensuring that the game is as impressive, pretty, and fun as humanly possible. Then there's the content designer, frequently also world designer or more narrowly level designer. These are the builders, the carpenters, the crafters who take the building blocks of all of the above and assemble them within the game into the individual events and moments of gameplay that the player will encounter when they're playing the game, often through their engine of choice's event scripting language. A content designer is the person who creates all of those random encounters, all of those interesting set pieces that the player will come upon during the course of their playthrough. If the experienced designer is writing the story, then the content designer is writing the dialogue and prose. All three of these design archetypes are deeply intertwined and can be a major point of failure in any project if any of the above aren't properly done. Of course, a good development team can mitigate a bad design, but if they're polishing a turd, then the designer didn't do their job right. As you may have guessed, considering how each of these design disciplines are tied in with a different part of development, there are a number of potential inroads. Call it self-deprecating humor, but I like to say that a game designer is someone who can art, write, and program, but isn't good enough to be an artist, writer, or programmer. Indeed, to be a game designer, though it isn't your job to be able to do someone else's job, it's your responsibility to understand their job and how it works well enough that you can effectively talk shop with them without ever getting lost. I'm no programmer, but I need to know what an array, an enum, a vector, and a collision channel are and how they work. I need to know the difference between world space and screen space, and I need to understand the difference between high poly and low poly meshes, and to identify when something isn't properly skinned. I need to know how many texture channels can display on a mobile platform before asking my art team to build me a landscape. How many dynamic lights can exist in one chunk on a map, or if we can even use dynamic lights at all. I need to know my bone limit on any given skeleton, understand sound attenuation, high and low frequencies. Basically, I need to be able to talk confidently with anyone else on the team about their work, because if I don't know what I'm talking about, they'll know it, and my designs will be less useful to all parties involved because of it. And you have to know that they will always know their shit a lot better than you will as well, because to assume otherwise is hubris. But you still need to be able to ask questions when you don't know something. Needless to say, the less ego you have about your design, the better. Now, designer also needs to be creative, because we need to be able to take a vague idea often and visualize it as a finished product, and connect every dot in between. The systems designer will want to come from a background, or at least have passing knowledge in a technical discipline. Ideally, this can come from studying comp sci casually, working on your own one-man indie projects, or just being the guy who will open up a CPP file to learn how something works. The ability to script in at least one engine is a huge plus, and if you can't already, you'll most likely learn on the job. You don't have to have a degree in computer science, but you should at least have dabbled a bit in programming, even if you're bad at it. For experienced designers, as well as content designers, having an art or otherwise creative background is also preferable. Not to say that us systems geeks shouldn't as well. Having experience in level design, maybe creating maps or mods for existing games, if not an original product, are big pluses. And if you aren't already, you should probably start trying to do a little prototyping. Create your own mini projects, a single mechanic minigame that demonstrates your ability to plan out, build, and ship a working game, as nothing speaks louder than action. Additionally, understanding of project management principles, time budgeting, and so on will be a boon. Though it's ultimately the function of the producer in a game project to ensure that the project is delivered in time and under budget, the designer is just as on the hook if any of their work is impeding the process, and they're frequently the main buffer zone between production and the rest of the team. So back to the big question, how do you actually study or prepare to become a game designer? A lot of schools now offer degrees in game design, which is awesome that we live in an age where that's a thing. That'll probably help, but I can't guarantee that it will. I was a recruiter in the private sector in Japan for about 2 years before I got back into game development, so understand that I don't come from only a personal standpoint when I say that your degree really doesn't mean that much to most people in the games industry unless you're still getting one and you're applying for internship. Not to belittle the value of the things that you've learned if you do have a degree in that area, you'll definitely have a leg up over other junior candidates. But if someone else has a video game demo to show that they slammed together in their free time, that's interesting to me. So as circular as the logic sounds, start making games on your own first if you want to do it professionally. Especially if you want to be a designer. Making a badly scripted, badly arted game in your spare time is going to get you to the place where you can start talking to people who know their shit without making a fool of yourself. But look, making a game is a huge undertaking. I can't stress enough how important it is that you keep it tight and you use your imagination. If you can successfully add one cool feature to an existing game style, you're on the right track. I could easily do a video, if not a series of videos, on the pitfalls of game design. Hell, I might just, but for now, I'm going to recommend, even implore, that you understand that feature creep is your enemy and should be shunned at all costs. Rein that shit in, you'll thank me that you did. Now, indie projects, even ones you use exclusively as portfolio pieces, are gold. Participate in game jams, but know that if you do, nobody needs someone who's only a designer, so be ready to do the scripting, the artwork, whatever else needs to be done. Familiarize yourself with a few engines, popular or otherwise. It also helps to be obsessed with games. As a designer, be analytical. Play everything you can. Stop being an elitist about the games that you play. Every game has merit and the potential to teach you something new. Good games, terrible games. Every game is worth you taking the time to learn and unravel in your head. If there's a genre of game you won't play, you're only limiting yourself. And odds are, you aren't Sakamoto Ryuichi. You won't be creating masterpieces without ever touching anyone else's work. So immerse yourself in games. Be ravenous, devour them, but don't just play them for fun. It's a perk when you enjoy the games you play, but you should always be thinking about the game you're playing. If something's great, why is it great? If something sucks, why does it suck? I don't care if you only play for 5 minutes and just can't go on. At least you have a frame of reference to talk about why it sucked and why you couldn't go any further. Also, play other kinds of games too. Board games are amazing tools for designers because they necessitate that you understand the underlying mechanics. Tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, Fate, and Shadowrun are great tools not only to teach you to understand game mechanics, but also to teach yourself to be creative. Actually, this should apply to anyone interested in the games industry in general. With a few exceptions in some of the art teams that I've worked with, everyone in games is ridiculously passionate about games of all sorts. In my office, we play games every lunchtime. Heroes of the Storm one day, Dominion, the card game, the next, Pandemic the next. And John, Matt, and I, my fellow NPCs, roleplay every weekend. And time for real talk. Games are a labor of passion. Emphasis on both labor and passion. Statistically, games make you a fair sight less money than other parts of the tech industry. And though my company is one of those rare beasts where there's little to no crunch time thanks to realistic and responsible management, I also worked in companies where I routinely got home after midnight if I got home at all. There are not a lot of old boys in the industry, so when you see a graybeard like me in their mid-30s, 40s, or beyond, they're the ones who really love what they do, but know that it has the potential to be a very rough industry. Google EA widow. Get ready to meet a lot of divorcees. I really don't want to cast some kind of big ugly shadow over your dreams. I'm genuinely excited to meet and talk to every young person that wants to get into games, but I want you to know what you're getting yourself into. Because damn, it's rewarding. Watching people play your game and knowing that even though they won't likely notice, your name is going to scroll past when they watch the end credits. You know, if they ever get there. I don't know, I think this question kind of got away from me. Did that answer your question a little bit? I'm going to have to do a little bit more talking soon about game design pitfalls and so on, I think, but I hope this at least gives you a bit of insight not only into what game designers do, but also how to at least start thinking about becoming one yourself. If you want to learn about something specific in game design or development, comment down below. I try to read everything there, so if I have something useful to say, I'll try to make a video like this one to answer any questions we get. Thanks very much. I hope this was informative. Until next time, take care and see you soon.